So my name is Jeffrey Gentry. I am going to give you guys a brief introduction to what forensic science is and how it can be applied to investigations. So I'm going to give you a brief little introduction about myself. I have been a deputy coroner death investigator for the last 15 years. I've also worked as a forensic autopsy technician. I also have worked in a forensic toxicology laboratory. I've done teaching in forensic science and mathematics. I also teach death investigation and anything bloodstain pattern analysis related. My background is in biochemistry and molecular biology, and then I also have a master's in administration. And if you want to get a hold of me, you can email me at jeffreygentry.bpa@gmail.com. I created this little video just to show an introduction to what I do as a bloodstain pattern analyst. So I'll play this now, and you can just get a little feel for who I am.
My name is Jeff Gentry. I am a death investigator and the Central Valley's only certified bloodstain pattern analyst. When I'm not helping investigate crime scenes, I am providing free forensic science education to the world through social media platforms like YouTube and TikTok. Let me show you a few examples.
I created that video as a brief little introduction to one of my online training courses, and we're also throwing around the idea of possibly doing a documentary film about what a bloodstain pattern analyst is. I have, as a death investigator, worked more than 3,500 death investigation cases. That includes over 300 homicides, more than 350 suicides, and then well over 500 traffic accident deaths. So I've investigated those cases and then also prepared death investigation reports for all of them. I am a certified bloodstain pattern analyst, and that is through the IAI, that's the International Association for Identification. I'm also a registered death investigator through the ABMDI, that's the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators. And then I'm also an IAI certified senior crime scene analyst. So I hold a couple of different certifications in different things independent of my job as a death investigator. I also teach death investigation. I have several online training courses at the Death Investigation Training Academy. I have one on bloodstain pattern analysis. I have one on suicide death investigation. And then I'm currently working on a course about death investigation and all of the questions that an investigator should ask when they're going through their death investigations. I have several different books that I have self-authored. I have one on bloodstain pattern analysis, suicide investigation, death investigation, and then I've also created a fun little cartoon book about what it means to be a death investigator, and this is self-illustrated. This is one of my first attempts at doing digital art. So it's got some funny little pictures. It's pretty much appropriate for all ages. I am also the creator of a forensic science cartoon series called Mr. Mosquito Bloodstain Pattern Analyst. This is about a mosquito that uses his blood analysis abilities to help solve deaths and crimes. And then my wife, Julia, she has illustrated all these. So she started out illustrating with watercolor and then has since moved on to digital art. So it's a pretty cute cartoon series. My daughter made me little Mr. Mosquito plushies that we're hoping to use at maybe a comic book convention someday. But it is a forensic science themed cartoon series. All right, so on to what we're going to present today. What is forensic science? It is actually the application of science to the law. And I'm not just going to tell you what that is, I'm going to demonstrate with a case example what that means. All right, so most of our knowledge of forensic science comes from all these TV series that are out there, like CSI, Bones, Dexter, which is one of my favorites. He is a bloodstain pattern analyst, just like me. Criminal Minds, but they just kind of touch on it, and they're not really exact when it comes to the reality of investigating a crime. in real time. There's multiple different disciplines when you're talking about forensic science. So there's everything from bloodstain pattern, which is what I do. There's death investigation. You could go into like a laboratory setting and you could be a DNA analyst or a toxicology analyst and test drugs. You could be a firearms examiner. Or you could apply forensic science at crime scenes. You could be out there identifying evidence at a crime scene. You could be collecting evidence, processing fingerprints. So there's many different areas of forensic science. So tonight I'm just going to talk about a few, but they're going to be ones that can be applied to both general investigations and then also death investigations. So how do we use forensic science? There's multiple different uses for forensic science. And remember, forensic science is application of science to the law. So you can identify suspects at a crime scene. You can actually exonerate people that have been wrongfully accused. That has happened many times. You can identify deceased persons, and we'll talk about how we do that. You can establish criminal timelines. You can identify drugs or toxic substances in the body. You can also link weapons to a crime through firearms examination. And then you can even go and do digital evidence, like tracking cell phone records and computer records. There's many different applications of forensic science to an investigation. So how does it work? I'm going to explain what the scientific method is, and then we're going to apply it to a case. Scientific method, just very general, is your first step is you're going to ask a question. It could be any question. Then you're going to state your hypothesis. It's a theory. What do you think actually happened based on what you know so far? Then you're going to conduct experiments. Then you're going to analyze the results, and then you're going to make a conclusion. And based on your conclusion, then you might have to start that process all over again, but just in general, that's the way the scientific method works. And I'm going to show you how it's applied to forensic science in criminal investigations. Here's our scenario. Our scenario is middle of summer, a robbery takes place at home. A man is seen running from the scene with this crowbar, and he's wearing a mask. So now we're going to figure out how can we solve this crime using forensic science. So here's just a general idea of what happened. Crowbar is jammed into the door and pried open. So our question, was this crowbar used in the crime? Do you think that we can use forensic science to identify if this crowbar was used in the crime? Absolutely. All right, so our hypothesis, not very difficult. We see a guy running from a crime scene wearing a mask and holding a crowbar. Of course, we think he's guilty, right? Anybody would, okay? But you have to prove it. So we're going to go back out to the scene. We're going to take our camera, we're going to take scales, we're going to go back to where this crowbar was used, prying the door open, and this is what we're going to see. We're going to see impression evidence. So this crowbar is going to make scratches on any metal surfaces or wood surfaces. You want to photograph that with a scale, and you're going to keep that as evidence. This is similar to impression evidence used, for example, with footwear impressions. So maybe the suspect stepped in the dirt there at the scene too. You also want to take casts using stone material to preserve those footwear impressions. But going back to our crowbar. All right, so we have already documented our evidence at the scene. Now, my next step is to conduct an experiment. That's the next step in the scientific method. So I'm going to go and I'm going to break into a bunch of houses, right? Probably not. So we're going to take the same material, the same metal, and we're going to try to replicate what we saw at the scene. Because we're going to have to compare those little microscopic scratches that we saw on the metal from the door to the metal on the crowbar. Taking it back to the lab, and what you see on the left side is the scene, and on the right is what you got from your experiment. And if they match up, then you have a forensic link. So you have actually used science to prove that this crowbar was actually the crowbar that broke into that house. So that's an application of forensic science using impression evidence. All right, now our next question would be, who used it? So do we know for certain that the person that was running from the scene with the crowbar was the one that used this crowbar? We don't, right? Maybe he just saw it and picked it up, right? And he just put on the mask to conceal his identity. You never know, right? But you have to prove that. So now we're moving on to the next forensic science discipline, and that is DNA analysis. We've all heard about DNA, but how is it actually used? So DNA is found in all the cells of our body. It's found in our skin cells, our saliva, our hair, our blood. So it is part of our body the DNA is found in the nucleus of our cells, but is it found in every cell of our body? Okay? So DNA is our human blueprint, so to speak. It's what makes us us. It builds our body. And the little microscopic, or the little differences in our DNA is what can tell us apart. Okay? Now, do you guys know if we have DNA in all the cells of our body? Okay? There's one cell in our body that does not have DNA. And that's actually my favorite cell, the red blood cell. So a red blood cell does not have a nucleus and therefore does not have DNA. But the way that you can get DNA from blood is because of all the cellular material that's in blood separate from the red blood cells. Okay? So human DNA is 99.9% similar to one another. So myself, no matter how tall I am or my skin color, we're all 99.9% similar. So we're all very much identical, except for those little differences in our DNA. And that's what can be used to identify somebody with certainty. What about bananas? Did you know that we're actually somewhat closely related to bananas? Well, at least 60% close. So not exactly, but there's things in our DNA that are conserved, like the cellular replication, or the way cells divide. And so we're not just like bananas, but there are similarities in our DNA. Okay, what about twins? Do twins have the same DNA? So twins can be either identical or they may not. So I actually have a boy and a girl twin. Do they have the same DNA? No, they do not. So if they're not identical twins, they do not have the same DNA. But identical twins actually do. So therefore, if we have identical twins that are arrested and possibly related to this crime, could we identify them as having touched this crowbar based on their DNA? The answer would be no. So we'd have to find another forensic science discipline that could identify that person definitively. But you cannot use their DNA if they're twins. All right, so we've already talked about the impression evidence. We've already talked about DNA. So if DNA doesn't work, then we're going to have to go to something else. So we're going to move on to fingerprints. So fingerprints found on this crowbar might be able to link that suspect to this crime. So fingerprints are all the little ridge details in your fingers. And fingerprints are absolutely very unique. There are about 8 billion people in the world right now. And if you consider that we all have 10 different fingerprints, that's 80 billion different fingerprints in the world. There is no two fingerprints that are exactly alike. So that's a pretty good source of identification. So if you find a person's fingerprint on an item at a crime scene, that's a pretty good source of identification, considering that there is nobody else in the world that has identical fingerprints. Okay? DMV has fingerprint information on file, passports, and then if you've been arrested of a crime, they're going to fingerprint you. So that's how we're able to get fingerprint information and search it against suspects at a crime. One of the methods that the crime scene investigators use is they will take what is called a latent print at a crime scene. So say, for example, somebody touches a surface, but you can't see it. They're going to go in with their dust, and they're going to collect that fingerprint. They're going to take it back to their lab, not knowing whose fingerprint it is, and they're going to enter it into a system called AFIS. It's the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. And that system is going to automatically check all the little differences in your fingerprint and give you a match. Once that analyst gets that match, then they're going to physically compare it against what they have at the crime scene. And if it's a match, then you have an identification. Okay. Now, what about twins? So we talked about twins not having the same DNA, but we talked about identical twins having the same DNA. So what about identical twins and fingerprints? Do they have the same fingerprints? The answer is no. So fingerprints are a way that you can identify whether or not these identical twins have touched this crowbar. All right? So we've talked about 3 different ways that we can identify how that crowbar was used in the crime. Now, what about another different method or what about another different forensic science discipline? And that's forensic psychology. So we've already arrested our suspect. We've already identified through the tool mark impression that the weapon was used at the crime scene. We've already identified through their DNA and their fingerprints that they were at the crime scene. Now, what about when this person goes to court? Do you think they're just going to automatically confess to this crime? No, probably not. So we might have to get a forensic psychologist involved. Maybe this person has some kind of a mental health issue, or maybe they're not fit to stand trial. So that could possibly be determined by a forensic psychologist. So forensic psychologists are going to look at the brain and study if this person has any conditions that might have contributed to them committing a crime. There's other ways that forensic psychology can also be applied to a criminal investigation. One of the people who studied forensic psychology was Herman Rorschach. He was back in the 1920s, and what he did was he used ink blots, a series of ink blot tests, and he would show them to his subject, and based on their response to these ink blots, he would then be able to gather insight into their psychological condition. So I'm going to show you how that works. So ink blot number 1. This is the first ink blot that Herman Rorschach would show his subjects. This is actually called the fear card. So what you would do is you'd have a couple of seconds to review the card, and then based on what you see, you give a response. So the most common responses to this card would be a bat, a butterfly, or a moth. Most people that look at this card see that. Now, what if, for example, somebody said that they saw the grave of their dead relative in this card? Okay? Or what if they say that they saw the nightmares that keep them up at night? So that would all be very concerning, right? So normal responses, Herman Rorschach would say, okay, let's move on to the next card. But if they give a really abnormal response, that might give you some insight into their psychological condition. Okay, so the fear card, ink blot number 1, if you answer it quickly, also, it means that you can cope with new situations well. Most people can answer it fairly fast. But if you have a lot of difficulty in answering this card question, it might mean that you have some trouble with coping with new situations. I would be a little nervous if Herman Rorschach was giving me a test. All right, so ink blot number 2. Okay. Most common answer is animals or blood. Some people say that this looks like bears giving a high five. I've seen that a lot. Okay, now if you say that you saw blood in this picture, you might be feeling anger. Now, me as a blood pattern analyst, I see blood in everything. So, I mean, you can make what you want of that, but I don't think that I feel any anger when looking at this card. Another way that forensic psychology can be applied to a case is behavior profile or criminal profiling. The FBI has the behavioral analysis unit that does just that. So they'll take a look at maybe unsolved crimes or cold cases where similar mechanisms of like robbery or crimes fit. And then based on all of these different components and the way that these people are committing crimes, they will create a criminal profile. And it's actually been quite successful. One of the movies that deals with this is Silence of the Lambs. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. And this is where Clarice Starling, who works for the FBI, utilizes Hannibal Lecter to help create a criminal profile for Buffalo Bill, who they were trying to catch. Great movie. Okay. Now, can forensic psychology be used in court? So we know that all these other forensic disciplines can be used in court, like DNA analysis, blood pattern analysis, crime scene investigation. But what about forensic psychology? So that's kind of the pushing the boundaries a little bit. So is it really a scientific discipline or not? But I'll show you a case where it actually was used in court. Does anybody remember this case? Back in 1978, George Moscone and Harvey Milk were actually killed by another man, Dan White. They all worked in San Francisco. Okay, there's a movie about it called Milk. And when Dan White went to court, he said, he used the defense that he had poor eating habits, he was depressed, and that he was unable to make decisions. So that's why he killed these two men. So on one side, they were trying to say that this was a premeditated crime, and they were trying to give him, essentially first-degree murder charges, whereas his attorneys and the forensic psychologists got involved and argued that this was not premeditated, that he acted based off of poor eating habits. Now, I gotta ask, how many Twinkies and how many Coca-Colas would you have to consume before you go out and kill two people? Now, do you think the jury bought this? Okay, they actually did. The jury believed what the forensic psychologist said, and they convicted him of manslaughter and not premeditated murder. So that actually caused a few riots in San Francisco. Again, you can watch the movie Milk. It describes all of this. Okay, so now moving on to one of my favorite subjects, death investigation. So death investigation also fits into forensic science because you're using anatomy, physiology, injuries, physics, all of that to explain what happened during someone's death. As a deputy coroner death investigator, I take death calls, I respond to death scenes, I collect property, I'll generate reports, and then I also do death notifications. So death notifications, I believe, are one of the hardest parts of being a deputy coroner, just because you're going out and delivering news to somebody when they're not expecting it. So it is literally the worst thing that you're ever going to tell somebody in their life, and they will remember you for a very long time. So you have to do that in a very compassionate manner. So it's one of the most important jobs of a deputy coroner. And again, since 2008, I've worked over 3,500 death investigation cases. One of the things that I utilize as a death investigator, I have specialized training as a bloodstain pattern analyst. And bloodstain pattern analysis utilizes a lot of different scientific background information. So you're using physics, mathematics, physiology, biology, chemistry when you're testing blood, and then also fluid dynamics when you're explaining how blood will react to different forces. Okay. So what can bloodstain pattern analysis do for you? You can identify event locations, where bleeding occurred, where did it end. You can identify injury types, because different injuries are going to bleed different. So like an injury to the head is going to bleed different than an injury to the finger or the hand. Okay. You can identify weapon types. Different weapon types, like a gun, is going to create different blood patterns than a knife or a hammer. Okay. And then you can also determine sequence of events. You can look at the way blood has been deposited on a surface. You can look on or under the blood, and that can help you determine sequence of events, where blood was deposited within a scene. So just in general, and you can find this in my book, Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. Bloodstain Pattern Analysis is all about seeing blood at a crime scene and then utilizing your training, experience, and expertise to explain how those bloodstains were created. So that's what bloodstain pattern analysis is all about. All right, so a blood drip stain. A blood drip stain is when there's blood on an object and it falls onto a surface. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Whenever I do training classes and I use blood, I always use a little pipette. It's a great way to simulate just simple blood drops. So blood that falls from a surface onto another surface, if it hits at a 90-degree angle, it's going to make essentially a circle. Okay? We'll let this dry for a second, then I'll show you. So blood that falls from height onto a surface at 90 degrees, it's going to create a circle, kind of like that. So it's going to create nice circular blood stains. Right? Now, if it falls at an angle, try not to let this drip here, but if it falls at an angle, it's going to create an elliptical blood stain. And the lower degree angle of impact, the longer and more elliptical that blood stain will appear. So you can just take just the general shape of blood stains, and it can tell you what angle that hit the surface. Did it go straight down, or did it hit at an angle? Okay. Then there is impact spatter. So impact spatter is when force is applied to blood. So this could be from like a bat or a knife or some other object. Firearms also create impact spatter. So when force is applied to blood, an exposed blood source, that object is going to hit that blood surface, and then it's going to project blood out into a radiating distribution. And it's all going to create those little circular and elliptical blood stains. And you got to think about physics and force here. The more force that is applied to the blood, the smaller those blood stains are going to be. So here we had rather large blood stains. These are about a centimeter, centimeter and a half in diameter. But if you have an impact event where there's a significant amount of force, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of little tiny, like sub-millimeter size blood stains that hit a surface. I have pictures of impact spatter patterns that I can show you here. All right, so this is an example, just a silly example of how an impact spatter pattern could be produced. So we're talking about when force is applied to an object. But the one thing to consider too, and you have to think about when you're a blood pattern analyst, is there has to be blood available to create those impact patterns. So if you go out to a crime scene and you see a large radiating distribution of blood stains on a wall, you got to think that there was a significant amount of trauma that was inflicted on that person to get that pattern, because you're not usually going to get an impact pattern on the first, second, or maybe even third strike, depending on the weapon type. So you got to think that that person was probably assaulted multiple times before there was blood available to even create that impact pattern. So there's a lot of things you have to consider when you're doing the analysis portion of bloodstain pattern analysis. Here's another example of a little lower degree angle of impact. You see that tail that's created on those bloodstains. And the tail of the bloodstain is always going to point in the direction that the blood was traveling when it hit the surface. So when I'm looking at an impact pattern, I always look at the tail of the bloodstains, and they will point in the direction that that blood was traveling. That is always going to be the case. So here we have just a animated blood pattern being created. So you can see very clearly that the impact occurred over here, and then you see multiple bloodstains created, and all those tails are pointing in the direction that blood was traveling when it hit the surface. So when you go out to a crime scene, you can just very quickly identify what direction these bloodstains were traveling and where the impact likely occurred. You can do some reconstruction with bloodstain pattern. So using strings or lasers, a little bit of mathematics, you can measure all the different bloodstains within a pattern, and then you can calculate what is the area of origin. So if I were, say, assaulted right here in front of this wall, and an impact pattern is created on the wall, I can look at that distribution of bloodstains on the wall, and then I can use math and a little bit of trajectory analysis and determine where in space that impact occurred. Now that can be really important when you're talking about was somebody standing up when they were assaulted versus low to the ground, because obviously standing up, there might be some argument whether that could have been self-defense or not. But if somebody is assaulted on the ground and you have impact patterns low to the ground, you know that person was essentially defenseless when they were being assaulted. So that's what you have to consider when you're talking about the reconstruction using blood patterns. All right, we've got a couple more little forensic science disciplines to go. Forensic entomology. Forensic entomology is the study of insects, and it can be applied to death investigations or crimes. It's not only applied to death investigations, but it's also applied to animal-related investigations. So, one insect that we use in death investigations is the fly. And the fly is used because flies love dead stuff. So in the summertime especially, depending on the temperature, the flies will immediately land on a body and will start laying eggs in any hole they can find. So we're talking about the eyes, the nose, the mouth. If there's an injury on the body, they will gravitate towards that injury and start laying their eggs. And the flies have a pretty well-known life cycle, depending on weather and temperature conditions. So within about a day, their eggs are going to start hatching. So they're going to immediately start laying eggs. Within about a day, they're going to start hatching into maggots. So the maggots are the larval stage of the fly's life cycle. Within 2 to 3 days, they're going to go from a first, second, and third instar phase, and they're going to get pretty big, and they're going to start eating everything they can find, and they love dead stuff. And then after they're done, they're actually going to gravitate away from the body, and then they're going to turn into that pupa stage. So if you just see the eggs and on the body, you know it's been about a day. If you see maggots, you know it's been about 2 to 5 days. If you see the pupa stage, then you know it's been about 6 to 10 days. So that's how we can use the life cycle of the fly and forensic entomology to determine how long someone's been dead. Here's just a little animated thing about the fly, the maggots. They do tend to, we don't need to add that. So when they're eating, the third instar maggot phase, it likes liquid protein. And so they are pretty voracious eaters right before they turn into that pupa stage. Do you know why we do not use the butterfly in death investigation? They have almost exactly the same life cycle. They're a lot cuter, of course, but they don't like dead stuff. So we don't use butterflies in forensic entomology when it comes to death investigation. The flies, when they land on something, they're actually going to be tasting with their feet. So they taste with their feet, they eat up everything they can, so whether it be blood or protein, and then they go up and regurgitate it on surfaces and they continue to eat it. Flies can actually leave kind of pseudo blood stains at a crime scene. If they land in blood and land on another surface, they leave what is called fly spots. Sometimes they will regurgitate blood up on different surfaces. So it can get a little confusing, but that's when you have to use scene context to determine, is this a bloodstain pattern that we really need to investigate, or is it just side effect of the flies eating blood or regurgitating onto surfaces. On the left with the zebra there, I would be suspicious of that being a wound if I saw that on a human body, just because you see a hole that should not normally be there and you have insect activity around that hole. Maggots up close are pretty disgusting. They can actually infect living bodies, and it's not common, but if there's dead tissue available, a maggot can infect a living body. The last forensic science discipline that we're going to talk about pertaining to death investigation is forensic anthropology. One of the most well-known shows dealing with forensic anthropology is Bones. And a forensic anthropologist has to know a lot about the human body. They have to know a lot about the human skeletal system because they're going to be not looking at a complete body, but they're going to be looking at the skeletal remains of a body. They're used a lot in archaeology, but they're also used a lot in death investigations. So with my death investigations, I've had many times where we've received skulls, different parts of the body, and then we consult with a forensic anthropologist to, one, see if there's any injuries on the body, but then also to see if you can identify that person. Just a quick little bit about the skeletal system. Okay. Our skeletal system as an adult is quite a bit different than that of when we were younger. Okay. So a human adult has 206 bones, whereas a baby has actually 350 bones. Okay. And the reason for that is because when we're born, we have to be flexible. So all of the parts of the skull, when you're born, they're very flexible. But as you grow, so they're individual bones as a child, but as you grow, they become one nice solid bone. So you've got sutures in your skull where those bones fused. Okay, and that's the same for a lot of different bones in our body. So the reason you have more bones as a child versus when you're an adult is because over time those bones fuse and harden. Okay? Just one more way that forensic anthropologists can be utilized is they can look at the bones and determine how old you are. They can look at different parts of like the femur or the skull, and they can say how long has that bone been growing. So they can give you an approximate age. They can look at the length of a bone. This would be a human femur, and this is actually about the same size as my human femur. Okay? So based on that, they can give you an approximate age, approximate weight. How did that person walk? X-rays. Oops. So looking at this X-ray, you see that this person had scoliosis. So forensic anthropologists can actually identify different features of a person's skeleton and use that in identification if no other sources are available. So forensic anthropologists can be extremely useful in a death investigation. So that's just a little insight into forensic science, death investigation, and how all of this can be applied to crime scene investigation. Of course, definitely, I thank the Fresno County Library, and I hope that everybody utilizes their public libraries. Me and my family do, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and present this information to the county library. If you want to follow me online, I have social media. I'm on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you have any questions, you can always email me or contact me, and all of my books can be found on Amazon. Thank you very much.